Welcome to Wisdom Trek with Gramps. I am Guthrie Chamberlain, and we are on day 2465 of our trek. The purpose of Wisdom Trek is to create a legacy of wisdom, to seek out discernment and insights, and to boldly grow where few have chosen to grow before. In today's Wisdom Nugget, we'll be focusing on Psalm chapter 22, verses 11 through 21 from the New Living Translation. Psalm 22 is one of the most profound and prophetic psalms, offering a glimpse of deep suffering, but also a steadfast trust in God's deliverance. In the previous verses, David cried out to God in anguish, feeling abandoned and mocked by his enemies. As we move forward, we see his distress intensify, but at the same time, his desperate plea for God's presence and rescue becomes even more urgent. Let's read Psalm chapter 22, verses 11 through 21 together before we break it down and explore the message. Starting with verse 11. Do not stay far from me, for trouble is near, and no one can help me. My enemies surround me like a herd of bulls. Fierce bulls of Bashan have hemmed me in. Like lions they open their jaws against me, roaring and tearing me into their prey. My life is poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax melting within me. My strength is dried up like sunbaked clay. My tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You have laid me in the dust and left me for dead. My enemies surround me like a pack of dogs. An evil gang closes in on me. They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. My enemies stare at me and gloat. They divide my garments among themselves and throw dice for my clothing. O Lord, do not stay far away. You are my strength. Come quickly to my aid. Save me from the sword. Spare my precious life from these dogs. Snatch me from the lion's jaws, from the horns of the wild oxen. The first thing that we notice in verse 11 is David's desperate plea for God not to stay far away from him. Do not stay so far from me, for trouble is near, and no one else can help me. David acknowledges that God is the only source of rescue. The situation is dire, and there is no one else that he can turn to. This is a common theme throughout the Psalms, turning to God in moments of desperation when human strength and resources have utterly failed. David is surrounded by his enemies, who he describes as being like a herd of bulls in verse 12. These aren't just any bulls, these are the fierce bulls of Bashan, known for their strength and power. This imagery here is vivid. David feels completely encircled by these mighty, untamable forces. In verse 13, he takes the metaphor further, likening his enemies to lions who have opened their jaws, roaring and ready to tear into their prey. This vivid imagery paints a picture of the danger David is in. He is not just threatened, he is on the verge of being consumed, like a vulnerable animal in the jaws of a predator. These verses express the urgency of David's cry for help. The bulls and the lions symbolize overwhelming danger, and David is surrounded without an escape route. What can we learn from this? In the moments of crisis, we can feel hemmed in by the forces of life. We, like David, we can turn to God. There's a recognition here that no human effort or solution can save him. Only God has the power to deliver him. In verses 14 and 15, David describes the physical and emotional agony in heartbreaking detail. My life is poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax melting within me. This imagery conveys a total collapse of strength and spirit, as if it's evaporating and his body feels broken. This description of being poured out like water suggests a complete exhaustion and a loss of vitality. It's as if David's life force is slipping away uncontrollably, with nothing left to hold on to. When he says, all my bones are out of joint, he is giving us a picture of the physical denigration. His body is falling apart, unable to hold itself together under the weight of his suffering. In verse 15, David continues the metaphor, saying, my strength is dried up like sunbaked clay. My tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You have laid me in the dust and left me for dead. His strength is gone, and he is parched, like a dried-out clay that has been left under the scorching sun. He's physically and emotionally spent. His situation seems hopeless. What stands out here is the completeness of his suffering. It affects him physically, emotionally, and spiritually. He feels abandoned, weak, and too close to death. And yet, in his deep distress, he directs his words to God, acknowledging that it is God who ultimately holds his life in his hands. When we face moments of extreme exhaustion, whether it's physical illness, emotional burnout, or spiritual dryness, we can relate to David's cry. And like David, we must continue to bring our suffering before God, trusting that he is listening, even when we feel that we are at the end of ourselves. In verses 16 through 18, David shifts from describing internal suffering to external threats surrounding him. My enemies surround me like a pack of dogs. An evil gang closes in on me. They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. My enemies stare at me and gloat. Here David uses an imagery of wild dogs, scavengers circling him as if he was already dead or dying. These evil gangs are not just a distant threat. They are closing in. They have pierced him. He is in visible extreme suffering. The piercing of his hands and feet is a chilling detail that foreshadows the crucifixion of Jesus, where he, too, would be pierced and left in the open for his enemies to mock. David's body is so emaciated that he can count his bones, a vivid illustration of the frailty and intensity of his suffering. His enemies mock him, gloating over his misery. Verse 18, it says, "They divide my garments among themselves and throw dice for my clothing." It's a scene that would later play out during the crucifixion of Christ, as listed in Matthew chapter 27, verse 35. This section is particularly striking because it paints the picture of a complete vulnerability. David is exposed, mocked, and physically ravaged by his enemies. It feels as though death is imminent, and those who should be offering him help or comfort are instead mocking and taking advantage of his plight. In verses 19 through 21, we once again see David's cry for help, and it's directed toward God. "O Lord, do not stay far from me. You are my strength. Come quickly to my aid. Save me from the sword. Spare my precious life from these dogs." David pleads with God not to stay distant. He recognizes that God is still the only source of strength despite all of his suffering. This is a powerful lesson for us. Even when we feel like God's far away and we are surrounded by danger, he is still our strength. David asks God to come quickly to his aid because he knows that there is no hope without divine intervention. In verse 21, David pleads, "Snatch me from the lion's jaws, from the horns of these wild oxen." The lions and wild oxen represent the deadly threat closing in on him, but David's faith remains. He believes that God can and will rescue him. He calls on God to snatch him from the jaws of death, as only God has the power to deliver him from the threats he faces. David's plea for rescue reminds us that God is always near, no matter how dire our circumstances may seem. Even when we feel surrounded by overwhelming danger, we can cry out to God for help, trusting that he will hear us and has the power to save us. As we reflect on Psalm chapter 22, verses 11 through 21, we are confronted by a deep tension between overwhelming suffering and steadfast trust in God's deliverance. David's vivid description of his pain and vulnerability draws us into his experience of feeling abandoned and attacked from every side. Yet throughout the desperate cries, there still remains persistent hope, a belief that God can and will intervene. For many of us, this passage resonates because it speaks of those moments in our lives where we can feel utterly overwhelmed, when the weight of the circumstances feel unbearable, and when it seems as though no one can help us out. But like David, we are invited to bring our pain and fear to God, trusting that he is not distant, even when it feels that way. David's faith amid his suffering offers us a profound example how we can approach God in our darkest moments. No matter how far away God may seem, he is always present, and his power to deliver us, even from the most hopeless situation, remains undiminished. Thank you for joining me on our Wisdom Trek today. As we continue to journey through Psalms together, let's remember to place our trust in God, who hears our cries and has the power to rescue us. Until the next time, keep seeking God's wisdom, keep living on purpose, and let's continue to grow together. Now, if you found this podcast insightful, please subscribe and leave us a review. Then encourage your friends and family to join us and come along with us tomorrow for another day of Wisdom Trek, creating a legacy. Thank you so much for allowing me to be your guide, your mentor, and most importantly, I am your friend as I serve you through the Wisdom Trek podcast and journal. And as we take this trek of life together, let us always live abundantly, love unconditionally, listen intentionally, learn continuously, lend to others generously, lead with integrity, and leave a living legacy each day. I am Guthrie Chamberlain, reminding you to keep moving forward, enjoy your journey, and create a great day every day. See you next time for more daily wisdom.